And while he started to excel academically, he became known as the guy who loved to debate Christians. But all that changed when he realized that the Bible actually predicted world history and gave him peace about what lies ahead. Let's welcome our first guest to Hope at Night, Sebastian Braxton. Sebastian, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure. That was a pretty good introduction.
Now, you were raised in a home that really wasn't hostile to Christianity. Mm-hmm. What was that like, and how in the world did you start embracing atheism?
Whew, well, yeah, definitely loaded question. So my parents met at a Christian university. I was the result of two teenagers in college, couldn't keep their hands off each other. And then I came about. As a kid, I was always gravitating towards things that were very transcendent. So I was into Marvel Comics, I was into DC Comics, and anything that was, the concept of a God being and this all-powerful entity and the responsibility of that. So at 9 years old, I'm having these nightmares, and for some reason, I wake up. We'd never read the Bible. We've never had family worship. It's midnight. And normally I would sneak and watch TV on like volume level 1, right? Tom and Jerry or whatever was on late at night. But for whatever reason, this one night, I'm like impressed to open the Bible. The pattern was like this. I would have a nightmare. I would wake up. I would read Revelation probably for about an hour. And all of a sudden, I would just feel better. And I would go back to sleep. My parents had divorced. And my father was living in the Bible Belt, United States. Go down to live with my dad because a lot of African-American males didn't really know their dads. Grew up, like you mentioned, a really gang-infested neighborhood. And so I was like, this is an opportunity for me to spend time with my dad. And so I went to Atlanta, huge Christian community. And during this time is when I became disillusioned with Christianity because you're seeing, this guy in high school, he's driving a Bentley. His dad's the pastor of one of the biggest churches there. 16 years old, driving a $100,000 car. And this young lady came to me and was like, hey, we're having a raffle at our church. You could win the pastor's Bentley. And I'm like, Jesus was poor. So what, you're raffling off a Bentley? Like I said, you guys have a bus that takes people from their homes to your church. If he sells the Bentley, he could buy 10 families Honda Accords. And she was like, well, that's not really how the church works. And so this sort of started me down. And then my senior year in high school, this was like the real crux event. So my senior class, they decided that, we're going to get together in the mornings and we're going to have a spiritual time, and the school allowed it. So we didn't have to attend first period, which was homeroom. So we're getting together and the weekend just passed, crazy weekend parties, the whole nine. And this sister stands up and says, hey, we got to give our hearts to Jesus. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, sister, just 24 hours ago, you were shaking your what? And I'm thinking, now you're telling me I need to give my life to Jesus. So this started a debate. And that sort of debate I guess you can say it was a catalyst for me. And I was like, I actually hate everything about this. And so I would go every morning just to debate. And eventually I got banned from the morning things. But ironically, I was in tension because in my biology class, he says, a random event occurred and life started. And my hand goes up. I'm like, explain that to me again. A random event. Yeah, just time plus chance plus matter. I was like, that makes sense to you? And so I'm debating with my biology teacher.
You were debating with Christians and you were debating with the evolutionists.
Yes, I'm in both camps. So now this sort of tension for me, when I get to college, I joined the Marine Corps. As I joined the Marines, they say there's no atheist right in a foxhole. I was one of them. And as a Marine, you're trained to kill. And in my mindset, which was before 9/11, I was just thinking, look, I want to be dangerous, a mercenary, whatever you can do. But I started to develop this social justice concern of human trafficking was very big at that time. And so I thought, yeah, if I can, use my skills to kill and to take out these sort of terrible things happening in the world, then I'm all for that. And so I had this weird sense of morality at the same time. So now you have this tension where I'm against religion. On the other side, I'm just intellectually can't accept evolution and the Big Bang. But then at the flip side, I have this weird sense of morality and social justice of like, why are we not protecting the weak? And this sort of coalesced into this sort of aggressive atheism, where it's like, well, what are Christians doing for these things in the world?
Was there a moment that was, you could call it the defining moment, where you decided, look, I'm actually a believer in God. I'm a believer in Jesus.
Yes.
What took place?
So in college, I was known as the guy who was debating Christians. And I pretty much know everybody on campus. I see this young girl walking through campus. She was beautiful. And I remembered seeing her in the student center reading her Bible. And so as I approach her, I'm desperate, right? I'm like, how do I get this girl to spend time with her? So I'm like, we should study the Bible sometime. So I'm thinking, I didn't really want to study the Bible, but I'll listen to you talk about anything. So in that process, she sits down and gives me a Bible study on Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, Bible prophecy. 4-hour Bible study.
4 hours?
4 hours in school, right? I missed my computer class because she finished Daniel 2 and she was like, well, there's another section, but I know you have to go to class. I was like, no, go ahead and finish. And I was fascinated because I loved history. And here she is telling me that I know as a historian, armchair historian, I'm not like officially, but I loved history. So I'm thinking, you're telling me that the book of Daniel at least was collected by 300, 400 BC, is predicting events that happened well AD. And you're telling me this is in the Bible. And I'm like, how is that possible? And I knew the history better than her. So she's like, well, after Alexander the Great, there were 4 generals. Yeah, Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, Seleucus. I knew who they were. And so I go home, only thing replaying in my mind is this study. And the reality of, if this is true, then surely this has to be inspired. Wow. There's no other explanation. How can you predict future events unless there is an intelligence that knew these things before they came to pass? I mean, that's the stuff of science fiction. Like, you're thinking Back to the Future, like all these type of things. Like, in my brain as an 80s baby, like, I just cannot understand how a book could have done that, and that other people had this book, and I'd never heard a Christian talk about it one time.
You felt like you were beginning to trust because you were learning about prophecies in there.
Yes.
That were clearly precisely defining events that were taking place or had come to pass well before that took place.
That's exactly right. And the thing about prophecy is the fact that what appealed to me as an atheist was that prophecy invites you to reason. It invites you to validate, because one of the pillars that grew out of loving history is archaeology. So now you can go and see David was a real historical person. Jerusalem was a real historical place. Nebuchadnezzar was a real historical person. So you're like, I know that these people existed. I know that this is true. You're just telling me this predicted ahead of time. So what prophecy does is Jesus tells us in the New Testament, John 13, he says, I tell you beforehand so that when it comes to pass, you might believe. And so faith rests upon evidence, not demonstration. And that was always my issue as an atheist. You always want me to be a Christian first, and then I'll find out why. But God is not insecure. You can evaluate him before you even believe. Right. See if I'm telling the truth. See if I actually can predict, and find me another path, another religion that has a prophecy that you can validate and evaluate from the outside.
Okay, so here you are as a young man. You had a Bible study with a beautiful young lady.
I did.
You were now wrestling with these deep truths.
Yes.
You were confronting that you're part of a bigger reality here.
Heavily.
What started to change from that point on?
Well, immediately what started to change was I had to read the Bible. So I'm like, if this thing is inspired, that means this is actually from God. Like, the stuff I was into in atheism, Area 51, like aliens, like you're looking at all these websites that are only online for like an hour. I'm sitting here going from, do we have extraterrestrial contact, to, if this book is inspired by God, that is extraterrestrial contact. God is not from this world. There is life intelligent outside of Earth that is communicated with us through this book. So I have to read it. So I start reading 15 chapters a day. And as this happens, right, all of a sudden I was into hip hop music, and I was actually working on a record deal with several different popular producers in Atlanta at the time. All of a sudden, my heart's not in it. So I'm at this studio meeting, and they're like, hey, Sebastian, we want to get you to the studio. We're going to record. We're going to do this and that and the third. They're like, okay, we're going to put you, and all these artists here on the website. And I was like, well, can you just take my picture off the website? So now the producer's like, what's going on? Like, what artist doesn't want to be featured on a website? And so this reading of the Bible began to change my party life. So now my friends are like, yo, we're going to the strip club. Not into that. Hey, man, we're going out to this party. No, I can't do that. And my friends are like, what happened to this brother? So they thought it was the girl. A lot of these perspectives on things started to change. But the last thing that really changed for me that was really shocking was the idea that I could live above my weaknesses, that there was a righteousness that could come by faith, that God would actually help me with my struggles. And I was in this relation with this Christian girl at the time. We were being intimate. I'm reading the Bible, and I come to the 10 Commandments. You shall not commit adultery. And I'm like, wait, but that's for married people. So, of course, my intellectual brain go to the dictionary. No, you're being intimate with someone who is not your wife. So I'm like, I wonder if my girlfriend knows that she's a Christian. So I call her. Hey, did you know? And she's like, yeah, I knew. And so I was thinking to myself, we should probably stop. She's like, sure. And so I'm like, oh, I'm scot-free. So I come back, we get together, and it doesn't stop. And so I was like, and so I get this sermon about how God can help you by faith to deliver you from your struggles. In this sermon, the preacher says, well, why do we wait to talk to God after the temptation? Why not talk to him right then? So in the moment the temptation comes along, my girlfriend's like, all right, I have to go. But then it's like goodbye, hug, kiss, all of this stuff. And so I'm like, ooh. You've never seen a guy so happy to see his girlfriend leave. I was packing her stuff. I was getting her jacket for her because I'm thinking, man, I'm about to see if this Christianity stuff really works practically, not just intellectually. The prophecy convinced me mentally. This experience is what convinced me of the reality. And so in this moment, my girlfriend is like, hey, nobody's home. It's just me and you. We said we would stop one last time. And in my mind, I'm praying because the sermon comes back to my mind. Talk to God right now. So I'm talking to God in my mind, like, Lord, I don't want to do this. I've never gone to church. I've never attended any spiritual community at this point in time. In my mind, I'm thinking, well, I've already fallen and I'm waiting for God to do something miraculous, right? Like, oh, boom, nothing. And so I'm about to lose hope. I'm about to give up and say, what's the point? And in that very moment, God supernaturally removes all sexual desire from me. It's like electricity came over my body. So I'm like, this is crazy. Pushing my girlfriend off, she starts crying. She's like, I think we should break up. She left. I came in my house and I sat on my bed and I said, Christianity is real. I'm going to be a Christian. And that very next week I was in church.
You experienced this tremendous victory in the midst of this struggle, this temptation, this battle.
Yes.
And it convinced you of the reality of God's goodness and his strength.
1,000%. There's a lot of things that can happen in life that can discourage you, that can make you question. But when you have an experience with God and you say, Lord, I'm going to take you at your word, and he comes through, that's what prophecy is. You take him at his word and he comes through. Not only does he do it prophetically in history, he will do it in your history, in your life. And in my life, that was the experience that I always go back to whenever I struggle, whenever I doubt, whenever I question. Sebastian, you cannot deny what you experienced in that very moment. And if God never worked another miracle in my life, that one thing is enough for me to go back to and to at least give that spark to my faith that I'm going to hold on to forever.
Incredible. In our world today, we have more access to Bibles than we've ever had before. There are more preachers probably around than we've ever had before.
It's true.
Why do you think atheism still exists in our world today? And to top that off, most people are atheists, aren't card-carrying members of the atheist club.
Gandhi has a saying where he says, I like your Christ, I do not like your Christians, because your Christians are so unlike your Christ. My issue was hypocrisy. That's what really solidified my atheism. It wasn't the intellectual. Yes, there were certain things in the Bible. God's going to burn you up forever. Like, I don't believe that. And these different ideas and ideologies that came in, they discouraged me from Christianity. But it was really the experience of these people do not look like the God of the Bible. They do not look like the Jesus of the Gospels. And so atheism today is mainly a practical atheism than it is an intellectual atheism. Because in reality, as I tell my former atheist friends, and I'm still friends with some of them to this day, 20-something years later, and I'm like, listen, if you want to destroy Christianity, that's fine. And you say, look, he's nothing different from the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. Great. But what's your answer for suffering in the world? What's the hope that you can offer people? See, I've been where you were on that side of the table, and there was no hope. There was battles in my life that atheism could not solve and answer. Yes, I'm struggling with this and that, temptation and sin and evil in my life and terrible habit, and atheism provided no hope. So at the end of the day today, a lot of people, if they're truly fair intellectually as atheists, they have to admit their worldview is really leaning towards agnosticism. I just want to say I don't know. I can't intellectually prove it scientifically. But experientially, I mean, you have nothing to offer. What's the contribution? So at some level, atheism is going to persist as long as Christians do not look like Jesus, do not act and treat people like Jesus did, with respect and honor and love and the humility to desire to serve and to meet. But at the same time, intellectual atheism is only going to become more aggressive because while your life does not match as a Christian, you're trying to intellectually debate with me. And I'm not fighting you because I intellectually agree. I'm fighting you because I'm hurt. I'm fighting you because I'm disappointed. Right. And I don't know if you've ever been in a debate with a person who They stop making sense, but you realize that they're holding on to this thing like a dog to a bone because it intellectually means something to you. And so many times when I get in conversations, one of the most important questions you can ask a person when you're in a disagreement is, why is this so important to you? Why is it so important to you that God does not exist? If you ask an atheist that, well, I guarantee you a story is going to come. I guarantee you an experience is going. My dad was a Christian, was beating my mom. My mom was a Christian. She was literally the most cold, loveless person in my life. Like, in these different things, they're going to go back to a story because you don't become that aggressive and it's not important to you on a personal level. But if we're intellectually honest, we have a saying in Jamaica, if a person is honestly mistaken, when you tell them the truth, they either cease to be honest or cease to be mistaken, but you cannot be both. The moment you're introduced to truth, and the moment I tell you as an atheist, there's evidence to believe Christianity. Christianity has evidence to support its worldview, but you still fight. Now we're not talking intellectually. We're speaking to the heart.
Now, I heard it once said that there are 5 gospels that most people read, right?
Mm-hmm.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian. And most people read the 5th gospel.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
It's not about the arguments. It's about the relationships and the life you live. If you just interact with people with kindness and joy and love and peace, or even your home and how your children behave, you have a certain sense in people's souls that, man.
A loving and lovable Christian is a great argument for Christianity, and a loving and lovable family even more.
That's right.
Sebastian, we're just getting started here. I'm excited about this conversation and where it's going. Any other questions? Right over there.
So people have been saying for years that Christ is coming. What makes them so sure that it's going to happen in the very near future?
One thing I can also add is when the prophecy that I studied with that young lady was Daniel chapter 2, this dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And it started with his kingdom as this head of gold. He dreamed of the statue Daniel interpreted for him. So in this prophecy, what you see is you're the head of gold. Then after you, another kingdom will arise of silver, then another kingdom of bronze, and then another kingdom of iron, and then iron mixed with clay. And then he says, and a rock is cut out of a mountain without man's hands, right? And this rock hits the image on its feet and destroys the image. So when you look at that, he essentially says this is several kingdoms that will come, which we know we have Babylon, we have the Medes and the Persians. Prophetically, we can study that out. And then the Greeks represent the brass, and then the Romans, the iron, and then Rome is not conquered, but divides itself, and then the iron and the clay, and then the rock. So if this prophecy is accurate, and majority of this vision is concluded, the only thing left to happen is this rock to be cut out and to strike this thing on its feet, which we automatically associate with Jesus's return, taking his kingdom, consuming all the other kingdoms, and consuming the world. So what we see prophetically is if 95% of this prophecy is completed and the last event is Jesus coming and setting up his kingdom on this earth and it consuming all other kingdoms, it also prophetically gives us a sense of time that says all these other major events have happened. This is the last one. Well, if this is the next event, then we're living in that time. And then you go to the signs of Matthew 24 and Luke 21 that say these are all the little markers along the way. That tell you that. And so one example I can also share is when I was in Botswana preaching, I was sitting down in the inn and a lady hands me a newspaper and it says, Jesus has returned. On the newspaper, 12-year-old boy says he's Jesus. He has 12 disciples. And Jesus said, they will say he has returned. Jesus is in the wilderness and you have to go see him in the wilderness. Jesus said this was going to happen. And here it is on the cover of a newspaper, a national newspaper, that Jesus has come back. And people are claiming that he's there. So this lets you know prophetically on a broad scale and even in very detailed prophecies that he gave, these things are literally happening before our eyes, that his coming is near.
Great. Excellent answer. Any other questions? Right over there.
There are many cultures and religions that have predicted past events that are currently happening now, and future events. What makes you resonate most with Christianity, and have you explored any other religions?
So coming from atheism, the biggest difference that I've found between Christianity and other religions is that Christianity is the only religion that allows you to evaluate without joining and participating in anything religious. You can just analyze the Bible, look at the prophecies, go to archaeology. With many other religions, when I had Muslim friends, I had people who were Hindu, Sikh, I had people who were also agnostic and of course other intellectual persuasions. And a lot of these things, it was never something you could evaluate in an external piece to say, here's the evidence as to why my view of the world, the creation of the world, the origin of the world, the morality of how you should live, this is why, here's the evidence. And most of them, when they present evidence, like, for example, prophetically, it's very general, it's very generic, but this is very specific. After Babylon will be Medo-Persia. After this will be Greece. After this will be Rome. When you're talking about the Romans came from the Etruscans, and these people were basically no man's people, that they would eventually become the greatest empire, like no one would have believed you in the times of Babylon or Medo-Persia or even Greece. Alexander the Great is one of the best generals in the history of the world, militarily speaking. There's no way you're thinking they're going to get conquered and it's going to be even bigger than Alexander. So when you look at the biblical evidence and the archaeology to support that, no other religion can present that amount of evidence. Look at the copies of the New Testament. We have thousands, 35,000 manuscripts of the Bible. To say, was this really happen? Did someone really write this book? So when I've compared to other religions, which I did do to answer that part of the question, I did consider them. But the resonation with Christianity was, as an atheist, as an intellectual, I need something that not only speaks to my heart, but also resonates with my mind. I don't want to have to believe in a way that causes me to check out my intellect, suspend belief for a moment, and just walk in this and trust it. And most of the time with my Hindu friends, my Sikh friends, my Muslim friends, they would say, you have to experience it. You have to go to the mosque. You have to listen to the Quran be read in its actual original language, and then you will understand. Well, for the Bible, I can just evaluate. I don't have to participate in that. And that's a big reason why it resonated with me.
You can see it in history. You can weigh the evidence, and you can know that it's true, that it happened. We don't see that in any other sacred book other than the Bible. And there's a reason, because there is no one who can predict the future other than God himself. And he has only revealed himself in the Bible.
Right, wonderful. Any other questions? Right over there.
This is more so a question for Sebastian. Okay. I was wondering if you think there's any middle ground to be reached with religious philosophies that try to solve the problem of suffering. So absurdism or existentialism come to mind. Do you think that there is some meeting place in the middle, or do you think that they're just sort of irreconcilable with each other?
The problem of suffering with religious answers, for example, existentialism and living in the moment, when you look at Sartre and Camus and all these different people that went down that road, you found that they ended life with no hope, right? For them, they thought they reconciled it, but then existentially, ironically, that was not his experience. That was not how he ended. And so I do believe there is an element in religious intellectual persuasions that somehow echo elements of what the Bible says. But to say that there's a middle ground, I would say no, because they would be superficially similar, but fundamentally different. The reason for that is, in the Bible, there's a great controversy, which the book of Job paints. And that painting says that suffering isn't always based upon the consequence of evil, immorality. There's a suffering that comes because of a greater conversation that's happening universally in terms of God and Satan. And because of that, no religious entity would ever find middle ground with that perspective, because you'd have to posit the existence of God. And secondly, the religious intellectual persuasions also typically are born out of an issue with the existence of God and suffering. So their whole fundamental issue is, I can't go with God, because if he's so good and so great, why is all this pain? When these sort of persuasions are simply trying to solve it without him. But in order to posit the question at all, you need God. Because the moment you say there's evil in the world, you're saying there's such a thing as good. Well, the moment you say that, you have to have a standard to tell the difference. That's a law. In order for it to be a law, there must be a lawgiver. So, and that's God. But you're saying he doesn't exist. He doesn't matter. He's not relevant. And I remember having a conversation with a Jewish atheistic friend of mine.
A Jewish atheistic friend. I'm putting all three of those categories together. Okay, go ahead.
And she was like, I don't see why I need God to be moral. I said, well, how do you determine what's wrong? Now, mind you, she's Jewish by heritage, right, of the flesh. And so as she's telling me these things, I don't need God to know right and wrong, this and that and the third. I said, so how do you judge Germany for the Holocaust? Because when they were being interviewed, the individuals who were part of the Nazi party said, I broke no laws. That was the law in Germany. If you were a Jew, we arrest you. And the person who was on the inquiring party for the international justice said, well, is there not a law above our laws? And he said, what law is that? The supreme law in Germany is German law. That's it. There is no law above our laws. And that moment, she looked at me on the plane and said, I don't know how to respond to that, because I said, the moment you posit what your grandmother went through in the Holocaust, you can't just look at your grandmother and say there's no general sense that some things are just wrong. And we got to figure out why we know that that's true. But existentialism and absurdism and even Buddhist philosophy, that suffering is a result of desire because you love things, because you're attached to them, that's why you suffer. None of those philosophies can explain something like the Holocaust. None of them can explain, and they don't provide adequate answers to that.
Great. Tremendous. Any other questions?
How do we live in the now in the face of all of these prophecies? Or do we even try to live in the now?
I think when you look at the book of Daniel, you find the first half of the book is narrative. It's stories. And the second half is predominantly prophecies. Revelation is similar, in a similar structure. The first half of the book is very historical, the 7 churches, all of these different things. What you find is there are principles of how Daniel lived in chapter 1, where he refused to defile himself in that particular environment. Even though the environment was going corrupt, he decided to stay faithful to God. You see in Daniel chapter 2, the power of prayer and having those friends in that community that you pray with, that you seek God with, and you believe that God can deliver you from any crisis. And you go to Daniel chapter 3 and you see a character where I'm not afraid to stand and be counted when everyone is watching, right? And so you deal with this being faithful to God and what you know to be true in anonymity as well as in publicity. And in Daniel chapter 4, you see a character of a person who says, I'm willing to tell you the truth and speak truth to power, even when it's not popular, and it may put my own life at risk. So I see some principles in the first half of Daniel's narrative that really drive home that point of how can I live in the light of these prophecies? And that really comes down to character and who you decide to be and the principles you're going to live by.
Right. It definitely sounds like the experiences Daniel went through are a bit of a microcosm of what end time events will be like. And we see his faithfulness, his trust in God, his prayer life,
Yep.
things that sustained him that will sustain us too.